Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I am your host, Jim Jones. So glad you joined us today. And we are continuing our study through the Daodejing. Today we are in chapter 25. And I'll start with sharing my screen. And then we can go ahead and jump right in. So one of the things that will happen now that we've been spending some time here is themes will begin to reoccur. We've already seen that a bit, and it will continue to happen. And this will give us an opportunity to revisit some of these from slightly different angles and, kind of refresh our minds on some of the things that we've been exploring. And this is definitely one of those. And I want to start this then with our overview, our visual kind of overview of how these ideas are kind of looking at the world are kind of put together. So when we're thinking about Tao, which is literally way or path, it's getting at the way of things, which is talked about kind of as its own thing, the Tao, but it's not really separate from these other elements. So when we talk about absence, which is Wu in Chinese, it is, in a sense, what we could think of as undifferentiated stuff that makes up everything. So there's absence and there's presence, which is you in Chinese. And so these are two different ways of talking about the same thing, that there's some kind of substance that either is in a formless state or a with form state. And it's talked about then as either the absence from which everything emerges from, or presence in which we see the things with form. And very colorfully, these are referred to as the 10,000 things. And within that movement from absence to presence and back again, which it will refer to as the return to source, there is a pattern. And these patterns, the way things function, both while they're in presence and in this movement to and from presence, from absence, there are patterns. And this would be what we're referring to when we get to the Tao, is this way that the, in a sense, the universe works. But we can't really separate these things. They're identified by different colors, and it looks like different layers here, but that's just to help us to have a way of thinking about and talking about these different layers of thinking, let's say. And then once we're in that realm of the 10,000 things, we see that there's this interesting relationship between things where there's the balance that happens between what they'll refer to as yin and yang, that is kind of these complements of different things, whether we're talking about something like short and long, those are complements to each other, but they only exist in relationship to each other. So there's no short, there's no long by itself. The only way those attributes actually mean anything is in context. And so there's an interesting observation that they have, that things tend to cycle, where what seemed long now seems short, or what seems bright now seems dark. So the yin yang kind of represent not only these complementary sides of things, ways of looking at things, but also their movement, their constant transformation. And so there's definitely this overall understanding of impermanence, that things are not forever, and they move back and forth. So in addition to moving from absence to presence and back again, you also have within presence this movement between the different counterpoints, let's say, of the different ways of being. And with this really worldview that they have, this cosmology way of looking at how things are, it has led to, we could say, more of an ethical approach, or a way of valuing action that says that it's striving for harmony. that if we can bring our own actions into alignment with the way things are, then things are going to go much easier for us, and we will be able to experience a greater flourishing of life. So we've kind of covered this a few times, but I wanted to review this because it's definitely going to come up in the text. But just before I move on from this, any questions or thoughts about how I've kind of presented this information?
Yeah, I appreciate the recap. It is helpful to go back and revisit.
Yeah, no, it's when we're dealing with things that are coming from a different perspective than what we normally do, repetition really helps to
Yeah.
keep it fresh. So, chapter 25 then is going to start to, in more of a poetic way, start to talk about this idea of Tao. Um, and so, thinking through what we just did in terms of that kind of structure of things, you'll be able to see how this kind of poetic way of talking about it starts to fit into those patterns. The author says, something unformed and complete. Right. So we've got unformed and complete. Before heaven and earth were born, so heaven and earth would have been part of the 10,000 things. So there's something prior to that. That would be the absence. And that something is unformed, but at the same time, it's not missing anything. It's actually complete. It says that it was also solitary and silent. Stands alone and unchanging. And this is an interesting thought here in terms of unchanging, because we just talked about how everything is kind of impermanent, that is constantly going through change. So, what are they referring to here that is unchanging? Well, in a sense, it's the pattern, which is in fact change. But you could almost say the thing that doesn't change is that everything changes. So it's kind of almost a circular way of kind of talking about it. But that would be the thing that the term they use frequently for this is constant. So the Tao itself would be constant, in the sense that there's this pattern that things unfold within, and that pattern doesn't change, but everything as a result of those patterns does change. Pervading all things without limit. It is like the mother of all under heaven. So everything is affected by this. Nothing is outside of its bounds. And then we've seen several times Tao referred to as mother, definitely taking on more of the feminine traits of how this is presented. And it is here talking about all under heaven, technically meaning what's happening here on earth, but we could probably logically extend this to mean, in fact, everything. But so the mother of the 10,000 things, as we saw actually in chapter 1. And I see somebody put in a chat thing, but I can't really see that while I'm doing the presentation. Does somebody want to?
Sorry, that was just me. Was referring to fractals. Like everything is changing according to a pattern. That's what fractals do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Taoism just fractals. Should have said that at the beginning.
Exactly.
Yeah, it reminds me of that saying, only two things in life are guaranteed: death and taxes. But I always think, like, so is change.
Yes.
You could add change to that list.
Yes. Okay. So then it says, but I don't know its name. Better call it Tao. So remember, Tao just means way. It's a common term. It's used for all sorts of things, right? You could talk about the way to go to the store, and that would be a legitimate use of that term. So it's not saying that this is. It's almost like a recognition that there's a pattern to things, that there's a way that things unfold in the universe. And that's all that this term is really saying. It's not its name. It's just, it's almost describing what it does as opposed to trying to name it. But then he goes on to says, better call it great. And I always find it interesting that great in Chinese is da, like da. And so if you talk about the great Tao, it's the da Tao. It's kind of fun. So then he goes on to say, great means passing on. It's kind of an interesting way to translate this. And there's been a lot of ways that this is kind of translated, but they're all getting to the idea of it keeps, it's like, well, if you look at like these three lines here, passing on means going far means returning. There's this idea that it's like all pervasive. It's like covers everything, goes everywhere, and it's part of that process of becoming present and becoming absent, that returning back to the source. It incorporates all of that, and there's nothing, in a sense, kind of bigger than it. There's nothing outside of it. And this is where he's getting with this idea of great, is that it is the ultimate in terms of where you can actually go and thinking about the nature of reality. So he concludes then with his, therefore, Tao is great, and heaven, and earth, and humans. Now, this is the first time that humans are kind of being elevated in this way within Taoism. One of the things that's fascinating, if we look at all the different schools of thought, the 100 schools of thought that kind of emerge out of the chaos of the Warring States period, that are all essentially trying to offer a Tao, a way to be that's going to provide a path out of the chaos that was a result of this massive social unrest. Everybody had a Tao on offer. And it was trying to explain, if you just follow this pattern, then this will fix all of the social issues that we have. And at the very first chapter of the Daodejing, we see a very sharp critique about that. And it says basically, if there is a Tao, a way, a pattern that can be followed, in other words, Confucius might say, follow this path of recognizing, let's say, rank, then you have the ability to follow that, but you also have the ability to not follow it. So the fact that following is a possibility or an option, the Tao on the very first line says, the Tao that can be Taoed, or the Tao that can be followed, is not the constant Tao, meaning that the Tao that the Daodejing is addressing is not one of these humanly derived ways or patterns or thoughts about how to structure things. It's a step above that. It is dealing with the cosmic level. Something like gravity is a pattern, and you don't get the choice of whether or not you want to follow it. It is, and there's no escape, right? It's like this is the level of Tao that they're wanting to address, which rises it above simply human concerns. And so in the past, we've seen, like in chapter 5, where it talks about heaven and earth being unkind, therefore the sage is unkind. There is this almost inhumane, we could say, approach, that meaning that it's not based on human concerns. It's not based at the human level of interaction. It's more about a cosmic interaction, and humans are just one of a piece of those 10,000 things within that. And so whereas the other Taos tended to focus more on the level of human interaction, the Tao Te Ching brings it out to more of a cosmic scope. But here we have, first time as far as I can think of, how we see the Tao Te Ching unfolding, an elevation of humans in a way that is making it stand out, which is interesting. So it's not completely anti-humanistic. There's a recognition that humans have an interesting place in this order of the cosmos. And part of the point here is, one, recognizing where that point in the order is, but also the uniqueness, I think, of how they see humans. Whereas everything else, whether we're talking about plants or animals or mountains or rivers, all these aspects of our world that we experience, the 10,000 things, they all follow the Tao perfectly. They all just do the patterns. There's no question. But humans are kind of interesting in that they can devise ways of trying to be that seem to go against it, that can create more of a struggle because it is resisting the Tao. Not that you can, right? You don't get to not have to pay, follow through with gravity, but we can try. We can act in ways that are like, I don't settle for this. Now, when we try to resist it or we're ignorant of it, we'll continue to fail. We'll hit our head against the wall. We'll jump off a cliff and come to an untimely end if we're not paying attention to those patterns. But if we recognize the patterns and we recognize in a sense, the inescapableness of it, then we have the ability to figure out how to do amazing things like flying, not because we are resisting gravity, but we're understanding how that pattern works and we're working with it. And it's when we work with it that then we are successful in achieving whatever it is that we're trying to do. So humans are kind of unique in the sense, not that they have the choice to disobey, but they can attempt to go against the Tao. And
Jim,
think,
could I say something here?
Yeah.
When you get a moment. I'm always looking for parallels because, I'm the person who comes at this from the Christian perspective. I wonder if you almost could compare the Tao to God's will as being parallel in a sense, because I think of that petition, the Lord's Prayer, thy will be done. And when you really think about it, God's will is going to be done apart from us, but the prayer is that we'll be a part of it rather than a roadblock that has to be steamrolled. And I wonder if that's kind of comparable to the notion of trying to be with the Tao as opposed to opposing the Tao.
Well, that's a very interesting question. And I think there's probably different ways that gets answered within Christian theology. But when we think about from within that framework, the idea of God's will, how can that be thwarted, right, is a question. And there's different theologies would say, nope, it's just going to unfold the way it unfolds, and we're either on board with it or we're not. And if we reject it, then there's consequences. And others that would say that it's more open, right? That it's not fixed, it's not set, that there are ways that we in a sense, kind of create with God. We've been invited to participate in that within certain ways of viewing that from a Christian perspective.
But that's a more modernist view. That's not a traditional Orthodox view.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying there's a different approaches to it. So, yeah. And it gets into like some of the questions about, with like Calvin and whether or not there's a predetermined or, all that kind of stuff too. But yeah, you could definitely see some similarities in the idea that there's some overarching pattern or force that, in this case, if you're going to talk about it as God or God's will, and then the fact that humans have the ability to resist or participate, could be seen as a similar direction for sure.
And the Taoist view, it would seem to me, is not a modernist view. It's a more traditional view that by God the Tao is going to happen with or without you. Is at least what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, they wouldn't probably add the by God part in there.
Yeah, right. I understand that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Forgive me, Jim. I can't help myself,
No worries, Rob. Definitely appreciate the input. Yeah, it's more of it's like how electricity works, how electrons are interacting with between atoms that allow molecules to form by creating these different types of bonds. These are all patterns that are essential for how everything unfolds, and there's no changing it, right? It is, and we either get on board with how it works or we don't. And if we don't, we just kind of set ourselves up to struggle more greatly. So yeah, there's definitely these patterns, and obviously they're not looking at how atoms form or anything like that, but it is interesting how we can see kind of the parallels in terms of modern physics and this understanding of like the laws of physics and how things unfold, and basically the more we learn to work with them, the more successful we are. But I think it's interesting here that humans are being called out as one of the things that are considered great within the Taoist text, which is a bit unusual. It's not the typical way that they talk about it. 4 great things in the world. Aren't humans one of them? Fascinating. And then it concludes by talking about how, maybe in an ideal sense for the humans, but with everything else, kind of the pattern that it follows, the order of things, almost like what do things follow in the sense of emulate, right? So humans follow earth, earth follows heaven, heaven follows Tao. And I should clarify here again that when we're talking about heaven in this context, it's more like looking up at the skies, or could it also include like the sun, moon, and stars? It's not a location of like in a divine sense where there's deities. It's just dealing with, in a broader sense, the cosmos. So when it's talking about earth following heaven, it's the idea that we see the shifting of, like, let's say the sun and the moon, and it brings about what seems like on earth this idea of day and night. Or when we see the shifting of where the stars are in the sky, we have the shifting of the patterns on earth. So this is how there's this connection between what they see up in the heavens and what happens on the earth, and how the earth is following heaven is the way it's described. And so then humans then would be on the earth, and part of, and I think this would be in the ideal order for the Taoists, that they're following those patterns that they see on earth. Then of course the uniqueness with humans is that they alone, it appears, have the ability to really go against that, and in a way that's different from the rest of the 10,000 things. So humans follow earth, earth follows heaven, heaven follows Tao. So there's these overall patterns that even heaven itself is following. And then it says, excuse me, Tao follows its own nature. So the point here is that there's nothing beyond it. There's no context in which the Tao is situated. Tao is the context, and there is nothing beyond it or above it. So we're definitely from a looking at, even though they wouldn't have used this kind of term, a very much so a naturalistic kind of view of the universe, that there's these patterns or these laws that dictate how everything relates to each other and how things unfold. And that is as far out as it goes. There's nothing beyond that. And everything else is kind of contained within it. So this would be, again, big picture overview of where the Taoist is coming from. But then this is going to come with some implications. And that's kind of where I want to take this. But just before I jump there, any thoughts about this chapter and how it unfolds?
I would have one question, Jim, if you don't mind. If
Please.
we, especially in the aspect, the last few things that you just said about the Tao being the be all end all and nothing was beyond it, how does Tao then explain how did Tao come to be?
Well, and this is a definite contrast between Western cosmologies, how we understand the origin of the universe, and Chinese. At least in ancient Chinese, there's definitely a move, and it's probably as a result of more exposure and contact with Western thinking. But in the early cosmologies within China, as far as I can tell, they're not actually trying to answer that question. They just look at how does it work, not so much where did it come from.
Mhm.
Yeah. And
But wouldn't, sorry,
no, it's okay. Go ahead.
I wonder then, wouldn't it be interesting to know or pertinent to know that if there is a pattern that creates DAOs, that there, that there may be more of them, that there may be more, you know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
if it's all about patterns and following them or not following them, maybe there's just like, but I think about it, the solar system, the galaxies and everything, like how it scales up, like how there's always a pattern that it still follows. I wonder if there was more, it would be more in that kind of sense or aspect.
Yeah, it's interesting because even in contemporary physics, there's a thing called a Planck length. And basically, it's the smallest unit of measurement, which you think, how could there be a small, right? But there's a point you can't go beyond. And they're not saying that we can't go beyond. Well, the speculation is not that this is something you can't go beyond because we don't have the capabilities, but that there is nothing smaller, that at the very bottom layer, things are pixelated, right? They're granular. There is, in fact, quanta and quantum stuff, right? Whether you're talking about quantum mechanics or physics, whatever, is the idea that everything, including space, can be quantized to that final point. And so we could ask, well, what's beyond that? But that might not be a useful answer, right? Or what happened before the Big Bang, if the Big Bang is what happened. Don't know, right? And maybe there's no way to answer that question. We can speculate about things, but there might not be any way that we could actually answer it. So I think that what's happening here, which would be very much in keeping with what we're seeing so far within the Daodejing, is it's much more concerned about things that they can do something with, like from a practical perspective or from a useful perspective. Almost, I don't want to say utilitarian, but almost, right? And
would it be fair to say, Jim, would it be fair to say that physicists entertain the possibility that at some point they'll be able to see beyond the Big Bang?
I don't.
There's definitely a lot of conversation about that possibility. Just the other day, I was watching a video in that kind of context, so I think some do.
Yeah, I mean, but I think it's more about speculation, right? Of trying to calculate what could have been, because, well, depending on what Big Bang is, it would definitely create a roadblock from many of our normal ways of understanding things about the past, if it is in fact what they think it is. So certainly there's a lot of speculation and ways that people are wanting to try and find an answer to that question, and that's fine. I definitely am all for the quest for knowledge, but I'm just trying to bring a parallel into the question of that there's also this point, even within modern physics, where it's okay to say, I don't know, right? And I think for the Taoists, there's things that they didn't think that there was a way to know, and they weren't necessarily concerned about that because they're much more concerned about the things that had the impact on how they're supposed to live right now. And certainly they're not physicists in the sense that we're thinking of, like, they had no theory of quantum mechanics going on here, even though it seems to kind of match up well. It's just the fact that they're recognizing that there's patterns to the way things unfold. And there doesn't appear to be anything behind the patterns other than the fact that they are just a brute reality of life, that it's a pattern that happens and it governs how everything unfolds. And that was enough for them to get a sense of how do I operate in this world. That makes sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, but certainly there's lots of fun speculation within physics, and they have not come to the end of what there is to learn from physics, obviously. But it's always fascinating to see. And of course they come up with, different ideas of, perhaps what happens with something like the Big Bang is the other side of a black hole. And so all of the black holes we see are actually entry points into new universes that are born, and, all kinds of fun speculation about stuff. All right, here we go. So what we're looking at is a worldview, a way of perceiving the world that's going to have an impact in lots of different ways. It's opening perception, but it's also closing off perception, or ideas about opportunities for action, how we choose to act. So whether we're talking about this Taoist / naturalist kind of approach, or we're looking at something that's more from a theological approach like Christianity or any of the other world religions, or those are kind of like several fundamental kind of worldviews. There could be other ones that are kind of built within that, where we might think of them more as philosophies, but they kind of work the same way. And this could be something like capitalism or Marxism, or democracy versus authoritarianism or anarchy. Would be different worldviews as well, maybe not as fundamental, but they kind of function in the same way. It helps us to see certain things, become aware of certain things, because it's giving us a context to make sense out of certain things, but it also closes off things too. So it's a trade-off that you can't really avoid, that once you start to look at things from a certain angle, that's the angle that you are looking from. And just like I can't see the room from a different perspective than the one I'm currently sitting in, I couldn't get up and move and sit in a different perspective, but then I'm limited from that angle. And there's just no way around that. It's just the one of those natures of reality type thing, that as soon as we adopt a perspective, it opens up certain things and closes off others. And the best we can do is to be aware of the fact that we have adopted a position and it's closing off those perspectives. So the more we can be aware of that, and this would again be a key thing for the Taoist, is to always be recognizing there's filters constantly that are impeding how we are looking at the world. And the more we can strip those away, the more we can try and get at what is versus what we wish to be, or what others tell us is what it is. But it's a never-ending challenge, because you're always adopting a perspective that's creating, of necessity, the problem of how do we see, how do we perceive. So I wanted to look at a couple of the things in terms of, if this particular worldview is adopted, what types of things then end up as a consequence for how we engage looking at the world. And definitely key to this worldview is the idea of oneness. And this is also sometimes described as monism, for, again, the idea of oneness. And that can be contrasted with dualism, or sometimes people will talk about non-duality. They sometimes use that in an interesting way, though. So be careful with terms. Don't just assume, but look into how people are using them. In this case, the idea is that there's only one thing, right? Whatever wu, whatever absence is the substance that everything is. It's just in different states of configuration. So that would be the presence, the you aspect, where it becomes the 10,000 things. But the 10,000 things are all still that same underlying substance. It's just in a different kind of configuration. So there's different ways then that we can think about this. We'll touch on that in just a second. But the other core part of the worldview then, besides oneness, is this idea that there's a pattern to how this one stuff does what it does. There's kind of rules that can be discerned. And then secondly, or thirdly, there's an order to things. Like we saw, humans follow earth, earth follows heaven, heaven follows Tao. Kind of an idea that's built on this idea of worldview here that we're seeing within Taoism. So when we think about oneness, there's a couple of different ways that we can explore this. So one is, the one substance, different configurations, and this would be something that definitely matches up well, whether we're talking about from a particle physics perspective, where everything is basically made up of particles in different configurations, or if we take it theoretically down a step below that, where they would speculate that even particles are just different ways of talking about agitations within some type of quantum field. And if that were to be the case, then literally everything would be one thing again, this idea of this quantum field, just in different ways of being configured. So we can definitely find a way across to our modern worldview that fits with this idea of oneness. The other thing that's very interesting, and this kind of comes out with the yin-yang way of looking at things, is everything, in a sense, only has its properties, we could say properties almost of existence, only in relationship to something else. So how tall am I? Well, that's always going to be a comparison question, right? How heavy am I? Same thing, always a comparison question. Those questions wouldn't make any sense if, in fact, I was the only thing in the universe, right? I mean, if there's no other thing to compare it to, height, weight, depth, color, anything you can think of has no meaning. Everything only takes on the attributes that they have in relationship to everything else. Very kind of like almost mind-boggling way to think about things, but it's a whole nother approach you can get to in terms of thinking about how, in fact, everything is related to everything else in a way that's not simply, this is something that I use, or I'm related to this person, by marriage or something like that. But it's literally the existence of everything depends on the existence of everything else, because if nothing else existed, nothing would exist. It only exists in relationship. So it kind of requires everything to be there for any one thing to be there. Just fascinating. That one is a mind blower for me, but I love
Absolutely.
thinking about that.
Wow,
Yeah.
Thanks, Jim.
That
may have broken me today.
Is that going to keep you up tonight, Martin?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just did it tonight. That is so insane to think about it this way.
Yeah. I love that myself. It's just well, yeah, we'll continue with this. Okay, then the other one is that there's also this chain. So we can think about if everything requires everything in order for it to be what it is, then we also have these causal chains that, in one sense, you can say, for me to be sitting here talking to you through the computer about this topic from ancient China requires this causal chain of events that literally goes all the way back to the Big Bang, and everything that unfolded from that, every single thing that might seem like it could have gone different ways, or if anything went a different way, nothing would be like it is right now. So when we talk about something like chaos theory, it's basically saying when you get into very complex patterns, that if you're off even just a little bit in terms of your data for trying to predict how things are going to happen, it gets off course very quickly because there's too much stuff going on. So literally there's no variation, there's no room for variation in what happened from the Big Bang to now to be at this point. Everything had to unfold exactly the way that it did. If things unfolded differently, we'd be in an entirely different situation. You can think about even just your parents, what if they didn't meet when they met? And if their parents didn't meet when they met, and their parents and their parents, all the way back, right? I mean, you go 100 generations back, if a certain couple didn't get together, you're not here, right? I mean, there's just no room for it to be different, for things to be the way they are now. It would be different in countless ways if even the smallest thing was not the same. Now, this can feel, in a sense, kind of like a cage, because we get into then, if there's this pattern, and this pattern dictates how things unfold, and this unfolding is driven by these patterns, then is everything, in a sense, kind of determined? Is it chemistry, all the way down?
Jim, it means every single one of us is a Powerball winner on steroids.
That's true. And in terms of world history, yeah, we're one of the ones that made it.
But let's translate it to the actual money, okay? Can I get some? Can I get me some?
Sure. So on one hand, it can feel very kind of like, what does this mean if everything is just, determined, because everything is these patterns, and I didn't really actually have any choice in these things, even though it feels like I have choice, then it feels like there's this cage. But really, it's actually the thing that kind of becomes very liberating, because it's only the fact, one, that we can learn anything is because they're patterns. If everything was random every time, not only would life not be possible, but learning would be impossible. The only way we're able to learn anything is because there's patterns. And when we learn those patterns, we now have an opportunity to interfere with those patterns to bring about different consequences and or different results. I know sometimes consequences can sound negative. I don't mean it in negative term. I just mean it in the sense of like there's a result that happens. So it's actually the thing. If things weren't determined in that sense, that wouldn't mean that we had free will. It would just mean that everything was chaos and there was no way for even life to exist. So what we really, I think, are after is not having free will per se, but that we are actually learning machines that can have an impact on our environment. But the only way we're able to have an impact on our environment in any kind of predictable way is because of these patterns. So it's kind of what can seem like a cage or very constrictive is actually the thing that opens up all kinds of possibilities. All right, so this would be some of the ways of thinking about oneness in terms of substance, in terms of how things are related to each other, and in sense of this like causal chain based on the patterns. So if we get then to the implications for acting, and I apologize for going quick, but we're running low on time. we might ask ourselves, if we're coming from this particular perspective, what is in my best interest? And the more we start to see how things are interrelated and interconnected and all part of this one aspect, it becomes a different kind of question, because what's in my best interest then now is very obviously related to things far beyond just myself. That is harder to recognize if we start to see ourselves in more of an individuated sense, where we're actually a separate individual and everything else are separate individuals or individual things that can be either used or manipulated without consequence. So this is worldview perspective makes a huge impact in thinking about this particular question. Also, we could look at, what becomes more of a question in this is, where's my place in the whole? How do I fit into this whole thing? And how we think about things like meaning and purpose really tie into this question. If I'm just to use kind of a weird analogy, if we thought about like a car is made up of a bunch of different parts, but really the car is only the car because of all the different parts. And if I'm the handle on the door, I definitely have a use and a purpose as that handle, as part of the door of the car. But if I think of the handle as something separate from the car, that is just completely individuated, then it becomes a lot more complicated to think about something like meaning and purpose. Now it's disconnected, literally. So a oneness type of a perspective gives a very different type of answer to the question of meaning and purpose of thinking about particular lives, because there is an integration into this larger whole, and we can have a different way of thinking about the impact of that and how it ties together and functions in different ways. And then clearly there's the naturalism that's part of this. And one of the consequences of that is that there's only this one life. So if that's the case, then that's also going to have some big implications in terms of how we think about acting in the world. So that's kind of the core of this. We've got a couple of minutes. I'd like to pause and see if there's some thoughts that we'd like to talk about. Oh, hey, Dane. Didn't see that you joined us there. Good to see us. And Chaz, too.
I have a particular way of putting this idea, which is that there's this thing called the way of nature. And if you go with the way of nature, things will seem easy and you will be content. If you go against the way of nature, things will seem hard and you will suffer. Except that you can't really go against the way of nature, because you are a part of nature, whether you realize it or not. So
Yep.
Really, it's more like, if you realize that you're already a part of nature, then things will seem easy and you will be content. And if not, then things will seem hard and you will suffer.
Yeah, it is a funny thing that there's something being unnatural is kind of an oxymoron. There's no way for something to actually be unnatural. I had like a little thought experiment along those lines of imagining I'm walking down. There's this trail by my house that goes by this river. It's called the Santa Margarita Trail. And I'm like, imagine you're walking along the river there and you see a beaver dam. And you walk a little bit further down and you see a beehive up in the tree. And then you walk a little further down, you see the empty hull of an old vehicle that was abandoned and is kind of rusting out. Do we perceive a difference between the beaver dam and the beehive and the old car shell? And I think in a certain sense, all of us feel like the car shell is unnatural. It doesn't fit in. But why do we think that? Because humans building stuff is just like a bee building something or a beaver building something, right? It's a natural capability. If it was unnatural, we wouldn't be able to do it. But we have a sense of it as being, in a sense, unnatural. But I think what like Dane's getting at there is there's this in harmony with and out of harmony. And the idea of the vehicle feels like something that's going against the grain, right? That it doesn't blend in with the rest of it the same way that a beehive does or a beaver dam. And if we think about the consequences of vehicles in the environment, that has a very different kind of impact. But yeah, you're absolutely right, Dane. There is no way to do something unnatural, which is kind of interesting when we think about food too. But anyway.
What I really was trying to capture with that is that you can't actually do anything that's against the way of nature, but you can fool yourself into thinking you are, and that's where the actual problems come in.
Absolutely.
It's a matter of whether you perceive yourself to be outside of nature or not. If you perceive yourself to be outside of nature, then you are, I guess, in some sense, practicing delusion, which will have negative consequences.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else have some thoughts?
I like the car handle thing. Because
Mm.
sometimes, I mean, I feel like I'm just a car handle by itself. But if you think about being a part of something, it kind of stops that in its tracks.
Gives us a purpose,
Yeah.
belong to something bigger than just ourselves.
Yeah.
We're a community.
And that's really at the core of a lot of religion, isn't it? It's that transcendent experience, that idea of being connected to something larger than yourself. And it's not limited to just supernatural worldviews. It also fits even within the naturalist worldview as well. We just look at the connection a little bit differently. Well, I guess we'll bring this one to a close. This was a lot of material. And I'm glad you joined us today. And if you happen to be watching this on video and you'd like to be a part of our live conversation, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get links to our Zoom conversation that happens on Friday mornings, as well as if you happen to be in the Southern California area, we have a live meeting on Sunday mornings. So look forward to seeing everybody again, and have a good day.
Jim.
Thanks, Jim.
Mm-hmm.